As you can see, I'm the author of the forthcoming book, which should be published by the end of this month on the Rohingya. I was drawn to this subject initially, not just as an activist, but as an academic. When I first read about the Rohingya many years ago, I realised there's a paucity of information out there, and I was looking for some credible sources, and there was very little to come across. So I thought the best way to do this is actually to write the book myself. So I've spent the last 2 years researching this issue. I made a number of trips to Myanmar and Bangladesh and visited the various camps and installations there for research of this book. So it should be published hopefully at the end of this month after a very long period. So I'm going to focus particularly on the external players and perspectives in the saga of the Rohingya. I think the previous speakers have laid the foundation quite well. I think we can all agree that the persecution of the Rohingya is going on, whether you call it ethnic cleansing, genocide, or war crimes or whatever. There's a huge issue of persecution. And I'm going to come at this as a perspective of a campaigner, because I think that's appropriate for this issue. So the question of external players is a particularly important one. You know, there's some people who argue that there's nothing substantive that outsiders and the international community can do on the Rohingya issue, because this is a localized issue within the borders of a sovereign state. And the argument is simple, it's very appealing, but it's also wrong. I would argue the opposite. I would argue that change can only happen from external players. After all, the Rohingya are never going to be a majority in their own country. So only external pressure will ensure that there's going to be any change at all. So when if somebody poses the argument that outsiders can't make a difference, I will reply that outsiders are the only entity that can actually make a difference. And there's 3 essential, simple ways I believe that can be done. And this list is not exhaustive, it's just the simplest ways that I believe. First of all, we have to change the narrative when it comes to talking about Burma and Myanmar. We need to change how we think about this issue. There's public perception around a certain number of countries that are in conflict. If I were to mention the names to you of Palestine, Syria, Libya, Kurdistan, Kashmir, Crimea, these are all countries that have issues to be resolved. Probably the biggest threat to the new government of Myanmar is for Myanmar to be added to that list of a country that has internal conflict that has still to be resolved. All the international political capital of Myanmar is rested in the story of Aung San Suu Kyi and the idea that Myanmar is a new country that's emerging out of a brutal military dictatorship, opening its doors to international markets and opening its mind to democracy. This is the narrative that has to be challenged, and only activists can turn up the volume on the darker parts of what's happening in this country: religious discrimination, violence, massacres, and genocide. Take, for example, the news last year, at this time last year in 2015, about when all the Rohingya were stuck out in boats in the middle of the sea. This was presented in the media as a Southeast Asian migration crisis, and very little was actually done to examine the root cause of the crisis. This is where external players have the best chance of influencing this narrative. Journalists, photographers, newspaper editors, documentary makers, campaigners, and academics all have a role to play in this. And we can learn from other cultural movements, national resistance movements, in terms of how power is mobilised. Today, people consume their news mostly from social media: Twitter, Facebook, Google, etc. And these entities use very highly sophisticated algorithms to determine what news you like and to filter out everything else. So if you're always clicking on sports news, the next time you log into your account, all the sports news will be pushed up and everything else will be pushed down. Same if you're always looking at celebrities and following the Oscars and so on, all of that stuff will be pushed up into your home screen and everything else is pushed down. And this has a danger that we reach a point where issues such as the Rohingya are familiar only to the elite that are following it, and it simply does not penetrate further into society. But there's things that we can do. For example, last week the government of Myanmar made a very strong demonstration to the US not to use the term Rohingya, and there's rumours that directive came directly from Aung San Suu Kyi. So this is no better illustration of how sensitive and weak the government actually is that they're scared of foreigners of using that term. Of course, what that means is that we have to use that term. We have to use it as often as we possibly can to penetrate the international conscious. A good example of this, for example, recently I read about the Rohingya football team that went to Malaysia to play some friendly matches. What I would like to see is that same team touring around Europe doing some friendly matches, and when the government of Myanmar protests, that story will write itself, the government against the footballers. Another example is in November, Al Jazeera ran a story about Buddhist rock bands. Some of those rock bands were of Rohingya origin, inspired by the injustices that their people face. They're working through a US NGO called Turning Tables, and they're doing an international tour trying to explain their plight. So stuff like this is material that writes itself. There's also the business angle. Myanmar is now benefiting of billions upon billions of dollars of inward investment. If and when the Rakhine district descends into violence and chaos, many of those businesses will be embarrassed and they will lose their money. We should sponsor credible representatives, former members of parliament, for example, to meet and discuss and fully ascertain what the risks are of this kind of investment. And this is how we challenge the story that Aung San Suu Kyi is trying to tell about her country. The second thing we should be looking to do is to move the international debate from mentioning to petitioning. We need international politicians to start hardening their language about what is happening in this country. It is great that David Cameron, President Obama, the Dalai Lama, the Pope, the UN Secretary General have all mentioned this issue. But it still does not go far enough. They must condemn what is happening there. They must petition national politicians within Myanmar itself to change the citizenship law. Myanmar is, after all, a member of the United Nations. Citizenship is a right, it is not a privilege. And this story will, once again, a new democratic country being led by a Nobel laureate that is denying a significant proportion of its population citizenship is a story that writes itself. And we have to chip away at the political capital of Aung San Suu Kyi. It's very impressive that the ASEAN countries, who have a very aggressive non-interference policy of their member states, have put the Rohingya issue as a permanent feature on their agenda. Countries of Malaysia and Indonesia are all affected by the migration of refugees. And the international community has to put much more pressure on the ASEAN entities to bring this agenda higher up in terms of its priorities. This will send a very strong signal to the Myanmar government that the era of impunity is over. The third thing we can do is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. What's clear from the previous sessions, I think some of the previous speakers made this clear, is that the prosecutor of the ICC, along with 6 judges of the pre-trial chamber, are some of the most powerful people who can affect the situation. The prosecutor can initiate an investigation, and the pre-trial chamber can authorise it. They have to focus their investigation on events that happened in 2012, 2013, the violence, and try to charge individuals who are inciting hatred, individuals such as Dr. A. Mong, who I've written about. You can check it on the net. That was one of the names that continuously came up when I visited the camps of one of the individuals that's instigating the violence. So this is the points I wanted to make, that the position and efforts of external actors is a very strong and moral position. When all international political constraints to mass killing have been gone, the only thing that will matter is public opinion. And as one analyst said, public opinion is the world's second great superpower. And I hope we don't have to, in the future, have another conference in which we argue that, look, we should have acted a lot sooner. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.